Is the special relationship over?
I'm not sure if it was there in the first place. I've heard it said it was a relationship of give and take, but I thought it was a relationship where we give and they take. And I think in that sense it's never been special. I quote in the book from one of the government officials who said that we always talked about the special relationship in public as often as we could, but when the British weren't around, we laughed behind their backs about it.
The last time we had today's guest on, we enjoyed a really great conversation about what was even then a hugely important topic, which is America's increasing power, control, domination of the UK, whether that's the economy, the cultural industries, or even our public services. Britain is a vassal state of the US, has been for a while, and it's only getting worse. That was relevant a year ago. It's even more relevant today, particularly, of course, with the Trump White House. Trump being an overtly imperialist president, and that's nowhere more the case than in America's relations with Europe. I don't think Britain's exempt from those. Maybe you disagree. Today's guest certainly does not. There is clearly a marked effort at a more intense, hostile, geopolitically calculative approach to the countries of Europe by America, meaning that the conversation we had a year ago was prescient, to say the least. Which makes me ask the question, which will inform the next hour and a bit. Is it time that Britain ended its abusive relationship with America? Do we need to dump our toxic partner, the United States? To discuss all of that, I can think of nobody better than Angus Hanton. Angus, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you.
Your last interview with us was a sleeper hit. I think it's got something like 300,000 plus views. I wasn't expecting that, although I did think your book, which I will again big up in hardback, Vassal State, was one of the best books of last year.
Thank you.
How did you find the reception of it? Because I did see it being mentioned in quite a few other places, I think the Telegraph, etc. Did that surprise you?
Well, I was pleased that it got very good reviews on both sides, in the Telegraph and the Guardian, both sides of sort of political divide. But then I thought it would reach the fate of almost all books, which is to disappear without trace. And, sales were going quite well. And then my main marketing agent, a man called Donald Trump, came into power, and he seems to have given it a huge boost because he's done a number of the things that the book predicts, and he's flexed his muscles in a way that's shown the extent to which the UK is a vassal state.
Yeah, books can have such a strange afterlife. I mean, I wrote a book about AI, technological change, and like you say, you think it's kind of just winding down, and then all of a sudden Google thinks AGI is going to pop up in the next couple of years, artificial general intelligence. We'll talk about Google a lot actually today, I think. Trump being your main marketing agent, great place to start. I want to read a quote from Vassal State, which I do encourage everyone to read and to buy.
Thank you.
I really do. It's formidable. It's one of those, it's you and Brett Christophers. We did an interview with Brett Christophers about asset managers. And we did obviously the interview with you about Vassal State. And those two interviews have got the most political crossover. I've met people in finance, I've met trade unionists, and they say, fantastic interviews. Gary Stevenson too. They're not left-right. These are genuine concerns and points you're raising that I think justifiably find a really big audience. Anyway, this is the quote from the book. And this wasn't written last month. This was written a few years ago, I presume. Behind it all lies the gravest risk, one that we rarely consider. What could happen to the UK if the US were to break with the values shared between our countries for the past century? How robustly could British policymakers respond, for example, to a second Trump presidency that turned its back on the rule of law, worked much harder to erect trade barriers, shrank NATO, and promoted even closer relations with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin at the expense of Ukraine? You foresaw the possibility of all of that happening. Why couldn't much of our political class?
I think that our political class is in hock to the Americans, both culturally and financially. I mean, I give in the book, I give the example that most prime ministers and chancellors, after they retire, they go and take a job with an American corporation. So I think there's their orientation. They're looking towards Washington and the states as a whole for guidance, and it's hard for them to conceive of being separate and thinking independently. We've become a follower, and I think that's particularly true of the political class.
Do you think Rachel Reeves could go work for a US company after she leaves office? And which one would she potentially work for?
She's ideally suited for it. When you saw her welcoming the inward investment, what she welcomed in effect was US companies building data centers here, which will increasingly challenge domestic UK businesses. And when you've seen her policies, there's been nothing about tax, no concern voiced about how little tax the US corporations pay in their UK businesses. And on the trade front, both she and Keir Starmer have been very hesitant to criticise, in fact reluctant at all to criticise what the US is doing, either here or in relation to Europe. It's a good question. Who would she work for? Probably Microsoft, one of the big companies, I suppose. What Nick Clegg did was he went to work for Facebook, now Meta, as a lobbyist. He's probably a more effective lobbyist than she would be, but these politicians all have a lot of contacts.
It was the thing that popped into my mind. She welcomed, like you say, lots of the big tech companies, the Blackstones, the BlackRocks, State Street, all these, big asset managers and private equity people, et cetera, Larry Fink. And seeing that did make me wonder, this is, you could say I'm trying to get investment in the UK. I'm sure you think that. It is also, a useful job interview.
Yes, she's very keen on growth. I think we've heard that on a number of occasions, but it's a question of what sort of growth. We want sustainable growth, and I think we want domestic growth. Also, we need growth where we're import substituting, where we're providing our own supplies. It's quite crazy that social media is dominated by two companies based in California, and that they're helped by their low taxes and by regulatory system. I mean, the network effects and the fact that they're monopolies means that you have to make a determined effort to replace them. But I think now the enthusiasm would be there for a UK-based Twitter. Unfortunately, a lot of people are moving over to Blue Sky, which is another US, another California.
Unfortunately, you don't often hear that.
Well, it's unfortunate. We're just moving from one base in California to another. We ought to be moving to London or somewhere in the UK for our social media. I mean, we don't do much social media that isn't with people in the same country. So there's no logical reason why it needs to be based in the States, except that there's inertia and they've got the software. But the software is very recreatable now.
I mean, that's effectively what Russia did, right? With was it VKontakte?
Absolutely.
Just ripped off Facebook, made their own version, and
absolutely, they said we'll have our own, and the Chinese have done it forever. These countries aren't willing to be in the debt of the US, and also, of course, it's about the data as well, and the influence. And we've seen it recently with Twitter, that it gives Musk and Trump a platform, and we've accepted it. And I haven't seen, you talked about Rachel Reeves' attitude. We haven't seen her questioning that at all.
Has it surprised you, actually, on the media stuff? Because the last interview we did really focused on wealth extraction, wealth and value capture by US firms in the UK, pounds and dollars crossing the Atlantic literally every minute of every hour of every day of every week. I came here, I used Apple Pay on the tube. Like you say, that's going to Apple in California, right? $3 trillion company. It's a tiny slice of that payment. Same with Visa, same with MasterCard. The entire payment system we use is effectively an outgrowth of US techno-imperialism, as well as techno-feudalism. And we covered that really well. What we covered a little bit less was the culture capture, the cultural capture rather, and seeing, for instance, Musk inveigh on the grooming scandal, right, on X, was really, for me, a striking moment where I thought, wow, this guy with a social media platform can completely undermine not just British politicians, but the BBC, the British press. It was a real,
absolutely,
new empire moment for me.
Absolutely. And what's happened is a break with tradition, as in the passage you read out, a break with convention, which is not to interfere in other people's politics. And we've seen that you don't interfere in another country's domestic politics. And that's been completely broken. I mean, Trump talking about maybe funding the Reform Party or a party further to the right, or Musk talking about the same. It's and constant interference. And in a very patronising way, Trump has said that Keir Starmer is doing a good job so far. It's not really for him to say, and the tone of it is that it's his business, which it really shouldn't be. And of course, we've seen it in a huge way in Canada, but in the opposite direction. The attempted interference has helped the Liberals hugely, and they've jumped 20 points in the polls in a very short period, almost unprecedented.
If only Trudeau had held on for a few more weeks, you know,
well,
could have been the comeback of comebacks.
He'd done 10 years, and he was personally not as popular as probably a new person would be.
True. It still would have been very, very funny if Trump had allowed, you know, Trudeau to
yes, it does
climb the polls, and
it does feel like he could have waited.
I just want to say we are about to have one of these interviews, one of these downstreams in real life, in the flesh. And I want you to come and join us. It's on the 11th of April at Earth in Hackney. I'm talking to the one and only Ilan Pappé. I think the most formidable historian on the Israel-Palestine conflict in the UK. One of the best in the world. If you want to join us, click the link in the description. It will take you to the tickets and maybe buy not just one for yourself, one for a friend as well. Hope to see you there. 11th of April at Earth in Hackney. Me and Ilan Pappé, a few other people too. Really tremendous conversation. Look forward to it. Going back to Reeves for one moment, you are an encyclopedia on this stuff. So some of her predecessors as Chancellor, where have they gone on to work after leaving number 11 Downing Street when it comes to US firms?
They've often gone to JP Morgan. That's been a favourite hirer of UK chancellors. Even Gordon Brown went there. But David Cameron went to work for two or three different US tech companies. So sort of whatever they can get, really. They're out there in the market, and they often do speaking tours. And even if they're not natural speakers, and I think we can think of one or two recent prime ministers who perhaps weren't, the fact that they were prime minister of the UK has given the organisation that runs it income. So yeah, that's sort of where the money is.
Why don't American presidents do that, by the way? Why, you know, it's quite interesting seeing former PMs and chancellors like Cameron or George Osborne debase themselves, working quote unquote for the private sector. US presidents don't seem to have to do that. And I've had people say to me, well, of course, it's book deals where effectively the US deep state pays for them to not have to sell their labour and influence because it compromises the national interest. Park that, it's a bit tinfoil hat, but it does seem quite different.
They're so much better off, aren't they, the Americans, and particularly their leaders. I just don't think they need to. I mean, it turns out, actually, after an American president leaves office, in fact, while he's in office as well, he's not allowed to drive anymore. So his bodyguards don't let him, not on public roads. So when Trump was talking about buying a Tesla, he won't actually be able to drive it himself for the rest of his life, apparently.
And that's by law or convention?
It's by strong convention of the Secret Service. Wow. In order to protect him. They don't want to risk him driving.
That's extraordinary.
It is.
How did you know that?
I was just reading about it.
There you go.
But I'm sure it's right. But
it's a great detail.
But the other thing is the way I mention it in the book, the way they protect their presidents with the beast, as they call the limousine. It's a system that emphasises power, and that's of course what Trump has done hugely. I mean, these threats that he's made, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes reiterated. These are a way of pointing out to people how powerful he is and that they better watch out. And the whole humiliation of Zelensky, and then to some extent rehabilitating him, is all to say, you do what we say. And the British are in the same position. It's just not been so bare-knuckled yet.
Do you think it could be?
It could be. If the British Prime Minister decided to go against what the Americans wanted, if the British Prime Minister said, for example, that they wanted to have genuinely independent nuclear weapons, I think the Americans would stop that.
How would they stop it? Because I suppose in the past, of course, America has interfered in British politics in quite tacit, calm, behind-the-scenes ways. What would it look like with Trump? You think he would have a dressing down in the White House, or
I think, I don't know. There's so many ways it could play out. But when you see UK military bases, quite a number of them are essentially American bases. They've just badged as British, and all the decisions on the base are made by American officers, and often the currency is dollars. It's
Oh, really?
Yeah.
On British military bases?
Yeah, well, the American servicemen are going to be thinking in dollars, aren't they?
Wow.
So it's just how they run.
And these are UK bases which are being funded by the British taxpayer, I presume?
A bit of both.
Bit of both.
Yeah.
So the UK taxpayer is contributing towards military overseas bases which are using the dollar as the de facto currency.
I believe so, yes.
Wow.
That's how I've understood it anyway. I haven't been on one of these bases.
Well, good luck trying to. What places are we talking about here? Places like Diego Garcia, presumably, and the Chagos Islands? Or?
Oh, yes. No, but in the UK, and in Norfolk and north of England. Yeah, so American military presence here is very great.
And those are badged as UK bases?
Absolutely, yes. I should have come more prepared and known some of the names of them, but
is extraordinary.
They're easy to Google.
UK military bases in the UK using the dollar, partly funded by the UK taxpayer. I mean, that is the definition of imperialism.
Well, yeah, that's the nature of American power. They want to have their. If you think about it, every dollar of military expenditure there is in the world, including China, almost 50 cents of it is spent by the Americans, and they've got bases all around the world. I'm not necessarily criticising this. I'm observing it, but anyone who thinks that Britain has a kind of independent, separate power is really deluding themselves.
I'm kind of shocked. I'm not just saying that for effect. I'm genuine. When you said that, I thought, okay, he means, Diego Garcia. He means places in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, or, the Caribbean. But actually here, like in Norfolk, is kind of incredible. So we don't have an independent capability. How far does that stretch? You mentioned nuclear weapons. Obviously, we've got the Trident system. The submarines are made here. The warheads are made here.
No. The warheads are not made here.
They're not?
No. They're made in America.
But the missiles, I thought the missiles are made in America.
Well, the nuclear part is made in the US.
Explain all of this to me.
That's always been the way. We buy our weapons from the Americans.
But the submarines are made here.
Submarines, yes.
Are they designed in the UK?
I don't know. It's a good question, but I'm sure that the Americans will have a say in that, of course.
And the parts for the submarines,
Well, as I understand it, the parts for the nuclear weapons, we're dependent on the Americans. I mean, there is a slightly open question of whether, if a prime minister said he wants to launch a weapon now, somewhere, whether that would work. But certainly, I don't think it would. I think the systems are set up that it's dependent on the US.
As I understood it, the missiles are the bit that we effectively lease from a shared pool in the United States. I can't remember now where the naval base is. It's not. Where is it? Do you remember? Is it Georgia, where the missiles are serviced?
I don't know.
I think there's a joint pool, and the point is the missiles are allocated at random. Although in the trials, only the British ones seem not to work. Okay, we've had 2 successive trials where these missiles haven't actually functioned. Anyway, and the missiles are manufactured and serviced in the US, and the debate has often been, well, we have this independent nuclear capability, and you make these points and people say, well, that doesn't matter. Once they're on the sub, we've got 4 of these things, one is constantly at sea, or at least that's the point. If on a particular day, a particular month, the British government decides to launch one of those missiles, there's not much the US government can do. You think that's wrong?
I'm doubtful about that. I haven't heard the expression independent nuclear deterrent used for 20 years by a British politician. I don't think that's what the Foreign Office encouraged them to use. We have nuclear weapons. Yes, they can use that phrase, but the word independent has been phased out. And I think that's for obvious reasons. They would say we can't conceive of using them independently of the Americans. But then there's a detailed question of whether in practice they could. But actually all this is, in some ways, it's it's all the detail about when you integrate your military system with that of another country. How that works isn't the important thing. The important thing is how you disintegrate it, how you separate it if you want to. And there, I think that the key thing is that the British, at the moment, still don't want to do that, whereas the Europeans are realizing that they have to. So the British are caught in this, in military as well as in trade and other areas. They're caught with two sort of barges moving apart from each other, and they've got a foot on each barge, the Americans and the Europeans, and they've got to decide which way to jump. And Keir Starmer's assertions that, oh no, we can stay on both, just don't tie up with the sort of rhetoric that we've heard from Trump, and not just rhetoric, it's actions as well over Ukraine.
What do you make of Starmer's response to all of that? As an outgrowth of the things we're talking about, not about, has he been an effective communicator or looked, impressive on the world stage or whatever, but in terms of future decisions around procurement and whatnot.
He's in a very difficult position, almost impossible position, but I think he's got to jump, and I think he's got to jump the European way. And obviously he was sensible to get together, to be the person who got together a conference of the European powers. There's a lot of respect for the British in Europe. It always surprises me how much. And there's the expression that the more often they say they're honest, the more quickly you count the spoons. I think it's the same. The more often he says there's no tension between the US, between our position in relation to America and our position in relation to Europe, the more you look at just how tense how difficult that is, and how they really have to jump one way or the other.
But are there competing interests within the Labour Party? So Lords, members of the cabinet, somebody like Peter Mandelson, I don't know, who have personal business interests or connections or networks which completely or partially run at odds with what might be called a national interest argument.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if we've integrated ourselves commercially and militarily and politically with the Americans, and we start to drift away from them, of course there are ties at every level that are being pulled at. And some people have relatively few American links. Keir Starmer personally doesn't. He's one of the politicians who hasn't been to US business school and doesn't have. He's not conflicted personally in that way, but as you say, many of his colleagues are. Yeah.
I mean, David Lammy comes to mind. David Lammy, of course, I think went to JFK School of Government for a year, I think, to do a master's. And I do find it interesting. I saw Lammy talking ahead of the Starmer Trump powwow in the Oval Office, and he was being asked about the Chagos deal, and he said, "Well, if the Americans don't like it, we won't do it." And on the one hand, you presume he said that because he knows that they're going to accept it, and they did. But on the other, it did get me thinking. If he was literally, and I'm not suggesting he is, if he was literally a US plant or a US asset, a literal US asset wouldn't go beyond what he was saying in terms of vassalage. It was just quite extraordinary that you're not the UK Foreign Secretary. You're talking about the US President having the power of veto over a decision that's being taken by the UK government. So Lammy's one person, you could say, who has a conflict. I'm not suggesting how he feels, but has a conflict. Who are others? What other examples are there?
Just on the Chagos Islands, it's a slightly complicated situation because there is an American base there. So it would be courteous at the very least to consult the Americans on that. And to that extent, I think you could see that the British were sensibly saying, we do need American agreement before we transfer sovereignty of these islands to the Mauritians.
It's an American base. So Diego Garcia is an American base.
Yes.
Is there a British base?
Not as far as I understand it, but I might be wrong.
So the sovereignty of the island has been UK, but the air base was US.
Yes, and that was, of course, a lot of these bases. They go back to that notorious deal done during the war between Churchill and Roosevelt, where the British handed over bases for 100 rusty old battleships that weren't much use in the end. But the Americans, Roosevelt said he had to do that deal to make American involvement in the war acceptable. So I haven't really studied the links between Labour politicians, current Labour politicians, or ministers and the US. I think it's definitely worth more study.
What about past ones?
Past ones, they've ministers generally one of the things that we looked at was that I looked at in researching the book was the number of CEOs of chief executives of FTSE 100 companies, of our biggest companies, and I found that just over 50% of them were either American, or they'd been educated in the US, or they'd been to US business school. So the influence of America in our businesses was at that sort of personal level as well. I think that's true of politicians. A lot of them have been to the States on some sort of work secondment. I believe it is true that Rachel Reeves was working for the Bank of England, but while she was doing that, she spent some time in Washington. And I think that's not untypical. So there's plenty of opportunity to absorb American values and to make American friends and contacts.
It's really interesting. It's something that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later on. One example of a European country which is less vassalized, or isn't a vassal even, is France. And I want to know why that is. I mean, the easy answer is, of course, shared language in the case of the UK and the US. But I suspect it also goes a little bit deeper than that, because, of course, we had a shared language since 17th century, the early 17th century, and the founding fathers, and the Virginia Company. So why is France so different in its relations to the United States when compared to the UK? I mean, you just gave that stat, for instance, on CEOs. There's nothing like that in France. Is it just language, or is there more to it?
I think there's a lot more to it. There's a long history of an anti-American streak in European politics. It gets support, it gets votes, and so it sort of gets reinforced. But I should say I'm not anti-American, nor is the book. But I'm willing to characterise what the Americans have done to the British economy and the amount of influence they have here. I think the other thing in France is that there's a strong sense that they want to be independent, and strongly independent. They've been invaded too many times, so they definitely want their nuclear weapons to be under their control. And I suppose there's also a sense that they, along with Germany, need to be a counterbalance to the Anglo-American sort of wave of influence. There was a very influential book written in 1968 called in English called The American Challenge, which was by Jean-Jacques Sevrin-Schreiber, and he was arguing that the Americans are doing very well in their business, but rather than sell our businesses to them or work for them, what we need to do is copy the business techniques that work well. And he gave lots of examples of that in technology and in investment, in research and development. And that's very much what the French did. And that relates as well to their central planning. So there's been a real divergence of business cultures where the British are inclined to say, let's go for the free market, and what will be, and let's let other countries, including particularly the Americans, take over our businesses if they want. Whereas the French are much more protective of their businesses and much more concerned to plan centrally. But they also recognise the benefit of competition and the benefit of the free market. But I think so it's a really different culture, not just politically, but also in business terms.
I mean, the French really get a lot right. I'm very France-pilled, and I have been for a while. I think life expectancy for a woman is 83, fourth biggest wheat producer in the world. Talk about food security. Almost zero CO2 emissions as a result of their energy production or electricity production, or nuclear, of course. Independent nuclear capability. Mistral, one of the very few impressive AI companies in Europe. Great high-speed rail. All these things, you can go on and on and on and on. Amazing. And there's a lot we can learn from them.
Perhaps it started with de Gaulle, with his determination to, although he was being hosted by the British and dependent on them to take back the country from the Germans, perhaps de Gaulle's, he was proudly independent and for France. And although he was respectful and grateful for what the British did, he wasn't in any sense in hock to them. And it was he, I think, that kept the British out of the EU when they first wanted to go in.
That was a huge decision, wasn't it? I mean, I do often think that's probably the single biggest decision in post-war European history, because I think the whole trajectory of UK politics would have been different if we were a founding member of the European community.
Yes.
How might that have looked?
Well, I suppose that would have forced us from right through the the 60s and 70s to be more independent of the US. But so many ways it could have played out.
Speaking of de Gaulle as well, it's another thing I think about, which is the Grand Écoles. These training schools for a national political business class, which we don't really have in this country. I mean, we have Oxford and Cambridge, so you've got the feudal remnant. And then, like you say, if you want to go into business, you go to Wharton or, God knows where, Harvard Business School. But it does feel like a major strategic decision that the French made in the post-war period, which led to a distinctive political business class that we don't have in this country. Now, people might be watching this. We have a left-wing audience. You might be surprised there. And there was, why is Aaron talking about business class? Well, if we're talking about vassal states and dependence on the US and actually US business interests constantly trumping our own in this country, that kind of does matter. Has that gotten worse in the last 40 years? Let's say since 1984, when you got the FTSE 100 was launched then, I believe. Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better?
I think the real change when the American influence became really big in the UK was after the financial crash, after 2008-9. That's when so many businesses were taken over, and that process of selling businesses has just carried right on. I mean, in the last 5 years, 3 big defence contractors, 3 out of about 6, so almost half our defence contracting, at least by number of companies, was sold to the Americans. So Cobham and Ultra and Meggitt, these are 3 big companies which were sold for really quite low prices to American corporations since 2000. And they're typical, but of course they're very topical because of our desire to have more control over our defence industry. So I think it really accelerated then. So
those 3 companies, what kind of things do they manufacture?
Well, I think they're called weapon systems, and I'm not an expert on weapon systems, but it was said by the US, a study that the US Defense Department wanted that they were crown jewels, and effectively the study said if you could get hold of them, you should. But
Wow.
it was free market. It wasn't the US government buying them, but
No.
there was US government resources outlining what would be good to buy. But of course, indirectly, US government direct indications on what companies are worth buying are very meaningful, because what they're effectively saying is we'll spend more money with these companies if they're American.
It's not that different to the Chinese system, is it?
No.
When you think about it.
No. There's especially now that it's so much that the sort of strongman politics seems to have be taking over, much more centrally directed.
And this fusion of capital and politics.
Yes. Yeah.
In China, that's been there a really long time. In the US, particularly post-Trump. And then you've got the British centre-right still yapping about, free trade and free markets and no critique of any of this.
Yeah.
Which isn't good.
Well, companies and politics always overlap. I mean, the American hedge fund recently took a stake in BP, and it effectively forced BP into changing its strategy away from cutting carbon and towards drill, baby, drill. I mean, you may say, well, that's all business. Well, it's not really. It's very much about the political direction that America wants. And we've seen in the recent discussions over Thames Water that it looks as if, I mean, it's not clear at the moment who will take it over, but it's looking as if KKR will effectively have control of the company. So a New York financial group will control the company that supplies 14 million of us with water. So I think the politics and economics overlap is inescapable.
The hedge fund thing about BP, so when did that happen?
About 3 or 4 weeks ago.
I saw BP's shift, but I mean, when did the hedge fund sort of buy
Only
equity in BP?
Only a few weeks before.
Wow.
But they thought it was undervalued, and their argument was, well, if you do what we want, we'll establish more value. And so they're an activist hedge fund, so they typically try and get somebody onto the board. And
what's the name of the hedge fund? Do you know?
Elliott.
And is that who's the chief there?
Oh, I can't remember.
Elliott. Are they a particularly political hedge fund? I know it's a silly thing to ask, but in terms of
No,
party donations, etc.
No, I don't think so. I think they're just profit maximizers, but they're changing. They change what our companies do, and so however much Mr. Miliband wants us to go green, there's not much he can do if one of our two biggest oil companies, Shell and BP, if BP decides that in order to respond to US shareholder activism, it needs to pull in its horns on all this solar panel and green power, and indeed cutting its drilling, so that they've gone from a position of wanting to cut their production to it wanting to increase it.
See, this is why we have you on a second time, Angus. But it's true. I mean, you're absolutely right. Who cares about British Energy, which, by the way, right now has 0 employees? It's right now, it's just a PR thing for the government. It may become something significant, but that's confetti compared to Elliott piling into BP. By the way, still one of the biggest UK companies by market capitalisation, even though it's had a pretty bad 20 years. It's kind of it's window dressing, right? The Miliband stuff. You said a few moments ago about those 3 defense firms that were sold to the US in recent years being described by a State Department report as crown jewels.
Yes.
When was that report broadly published? Do you remember?
It was about 2018 or 2019, I think. So quite recently.
So it's cool. And was it a public document?
Yes, it was. But like a lot of these things, you have to dig around a bit, and because it wasn't intended for the public. Wow. But the Americans have a very good principle that we've followed, actually, of having fairly open government documents. Obviously, much more so than Russia or China. I mean, I thought this is one of the things we were keen on: democracy. So there are some good things in common, and we've to some extent followed the Americans on that. I mean, they had their sunshine laws before we had our freedom of information.
You're a very fair man. That's very true. No, that's very true. We're denigrating lots of things about imitating US, but that's a good thing. So there's a report that's published in maybe 2018, circa 2018, overtly calling certain UK firms crown jewels of our domestic defence industry. This could have been available to UK policymakers. Whether or not they read it's another question. And those companies are subsequently sold. Was there a regulator? Was there a political interest or a political lobby saying we shouldn't be selling these firms?
There were some people objecting, but very, very quiet voices, and not particularly the Labour Party, unfortunately. But even if they had been, maybe the Labour Party would have thought they were wasting their time, because the monopolies and mergers, well, it's not called that anymore, but the regulator for about mergers and takeovers, it doesn't have a policy of blocking, blanket blocking of foreign takeovers. There is a lot of talk about strategic assets and how they shouldn't be taken over, and we've had a bit of that from Keir Starmer. But when push comes to shove, they won't intervene. We've seen that again and again, and companies just get taken over. Particularly, of course, if the company is asking for it. It's not just the acquirer, but the acquired is saying, oh yes, please let this takeover happen. There'll be all these economies and synergies, and it'll make us into a bigger company, more effective. But of course, we all know that they're also compromised personally, because they'll get a non-executive job in the new merged company, and they'll get a good payout. So we can't leave it to the potentially acquired companies to make recommendations. We must decide what's a national asset and keep it national.
I mean, the paradigmatic example of that is Cadbury, right?
Yes.
Which was bought for, 7-8 billion by Kraft, the best part of 20 years ago now, 17, 18 years ago.
Absolutely.
And that was okayed by Lord Mandelson, the trade czar, the industry czar. We talked about it on the first one, but just to reiterate, people might be saying, why are you talking about Cadbury's chocolate? Okay. We can park the fact it's a great British brand, but this was a company which, subsequent to being purchased by Kraft, laid off UK workers, relocated to another jurisdiction for paying tax, and increased the sugar content of the chocolate. Obviously, not great for kids eating Cadbury chocolate in this country. So this was in no way a good thing for this country.
Yes, and it broke an undertaking that it made not to close the factory near Bristol, and it closed that. And
when did it close?
Right after the takeover, and it moved production to Poland for that product, as I understand it. But the overall point is that the business was particularly attractive to Kraft because it gave it a gateway into Europe, and it gave it a gateway into the former colonies, into the Commonwealth countries, because Cadbury's had this sort of marketing network. And so you can see why they would have wanted to pay more for it. But also they could put the Kraft products, the Cadbury's products through their network, so they could sell them worldwide. So it was terrific advantage to them. But it seems to me that the British should have said, no, this is a British asset, and we don't want more than a certain percentage of foreign shareholders. I mean, you call it economic nationalism, but that goes on all over the world, including in the US. I mean, the US wouldn't, there are a lot of its companies it wouldn't accept being bought by foreign companies. Indeed, it's not been very happy about TikTok's success.
Yeah.
But if a Chinese company wanted to buy Google, I don't think that would fly. So economic nationalism isn't something new. It's just that we feel a bit ashamed of it, whereas everyone else is doing it. And the French famously protected their yogurt company Danone by saying this was a strategic asset.
Doesn't the French government have a certain share of equity in Danone?
There are a lot of companies. It's got an agency that owns a lot of important French businesses. It works well. They give them a lot of independence. They don't interfere too much. Sometimes it's not a majority stake. The problem, I think, for the British was the experience of the 70s was that British ministers couldn't stop themselves interfering in nationalised businesses. They stopped the nationalised businesses making people redundant because it would be bad headlines. They interfered in how electricity and other products should be priced. And so it was quite demotivating for people trying to run a business, having politicians who were here today, gone tomorrow, and didn't know anything about business, breathing down their necks and insisting on politically motivated decisions.
It's something I've thought about with the new Manchester United stadium. The initial renders and whatnot going public this week. So Jim Ratcliffe is saying that they're going to, wealthiest person in the UK, not tax resident here, lived in Monaco since 2020. They're going to spend $2 billion to build a new stadium, but they're going to want public investment in regards to the penumbra of infrastructure around it. So trams, you presume, cycle lanes, blah, blah, blah. Could be hundreds of millions of pounds. Andy Burnham's keen, Rachel Reeves is keen. And I just think this chap has an asset which is clearly going to be massively more valuable with a new stadium served by loads of public infrastructure. He clearly doesn't think he should be paying for any of it because he's not tax, domiciled here in the UK, and yet he wants taxpayers to help his asset succeed. I would just say, we'll do the trams, we'll do the bike lanes, we'll do the roads, but we want 2% equity stake in Manchester United Football Club. I think that would be a sensible way to proceed. I can imagine the French doing that, for instance, but it's just so anathema in this country to our political class, isn't it? Absolutely.
But actually, he only owns 29% of it. The rest is owned by the Glazer family, who are American. So we're basically here, whatever ends up happening at the moment, we're talking about enhancing an American asset. So it's... Yeah,
God, that's so true, isn't it?
There is an issue, as you say, about Jim Ratcliffe and his tax. And he's actually done very well with his chemical companies, but in competing against US companies. But ultimately, I think it's likely that his business will get bought out by the Americans.
Ineos?
Yeah, we'll see.
What makes you say that? Because he's got this thing for buying UK brands. He's got Belstaff jackets, and he started Grenadier, all that's produced in France. Grenadier, sort of Land Rover ripoff. What makes you say that?
Well, he's an individual, isn't he? He's not an institution. Someone like Exxon, that have been going, for 150 years or something, or certainly over 100, they can see out one decade to the next, and they expand their refinery businesses here. So I don't know in what sense an older man can expect to be comparable to big institutions, big organisations like that.
That's really interesting. So if Ineos, which is this enormous company, and they have obviously these major sporting interests as well, not just the Manchester United Football Club, various other football clubs elsewhere. I think it started with a club in Switzerland, Nice in the French league, etc. Bits of this empire are now being sold off to fund, the complete catastrophe that's Manchester United Football Club right now. But that's interesting. So if Ineos was bought at a future date, by a US firm, then you'd have two separate, potentially US entities owning one of the biggest cultural brands in the UK, which is Manchester United.
Yeah, but I mean, on the other hand, Jim Ratcliffe is obviously very keen on his football, and he might buy out the Glazer family, but who knows?
Well, that's one theory about the underperformance on the pitch. He's trying to collapse the value of Man United so he can buy more equity in it. I don't think that's happening, by the way, but I don't think that's happening. But it's one theory. That is really interesting about the Glazers because, of course, they bought the club in what, 05, 06, 07, sometime around then. Debt leverage buyout. They then put the debt onto the club. They've taken out about $1 billion since then in terms of dividends, etc. Again, look at this as a business which employs people, which is a major cultural product and export, known by literally billions of people around the world. They take all that value out of that business. And then, like you say, the extraordinary thing is, after the catastrophe of their 20 years of ownership, they then want to redevelop the stadium and they want the taxpayer of this country to help underwrite the infrastructure costs.
Yes, but I would say that's, in a way, what you're describing there, Aaron, is a microcosm of what's happening in the whole country. If you think of an organisation like Amazon that produces millions of tons of cardboard through its customers each year, that cardboard has a cost in being collected and being recycled, and that cost is paid for by the British consumer and British taxpayer. The same goes for the telephone network. I mean, the telephone network, which is owned by mostly by a British company, BT, that's carrying all the streaming services, and the same goes for some of the cable networks. So, in effect, there's in the big picture, what's happening is that these US corporations are free riding on our infrastructure. And even the bigger picture, it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's their free riding on the costs that we spend on a system of law and order. So that if Amazon or Apple want to take someone to court, they'll use the British courts, and that those courts have a paid for effectively by taxes collected from everyone. So I think the Manchester United example with the trams is one part of one illustration of a disease where we've undertaken to pay the visiting, invading. These are two different, very loaded terms. The acquiring country, we're willing to pay their overheads.
You've just given me a great policy idea.
What's that?
Which is get Amazon to pay for fly tipping in this country and rubbish collection. Because like you said, it's a major externality of their business model, this massive increase in rubbish we all have. And at the very same time, and they don't pay taxes here, and at the very same time, well, much in tax, at the very same time, council taxpayers are having to pay more for the refuse collections, which, by the way, are getting worse, for separate reasons. So we should say, Amazon, we're going to have a windfall tax every year related to your profits. It could be 3-4 billion, and that will go pay for bin collection.
I agree. There can be unintended indirect results of these sorts of taxes, though. I think a chancellor 2 or 3 decades ago thought it would be a very clever idea to introduce a landfill tax to reduce the amount of waste that we put into landfill. That was the idea. But the direct result of it was the cost of hiring a skip went up a lot. And many builders thought, actually, that's too expensive, I'll just fly tip it. So the great idea of reducing the amount of stuff in landfill actually ended up in a lot more stuff being fly tipped. So you'd have to implement an Amazon tax or a waste tax quite carefully.
When did that happen, the landfill tax?
I can't remember, was it? It was a long time ago.
So that's why taking stuff that's why hiring a skip is so expensive.
Yes, big part of it, yeah.
And that's why actually councils are quite... There's a lot of permissiveness around uses of the skip and whatnot. Tip, rather.
Yeah, but it sort of works, doesn't it? Because it has made us more reluctant. It's made, when people are doing a building project, they're more concerned to think about how they could reuse the rubble on site, how they could reduce the amount of waste they create. So it has worked a bit.
Yeah, but I've always just been struck by why does a skip cost so much, and now you've illuminated as to why. So when did that bit of legislation come in?
It was quite a while ago, but then they progressively increased the landfill tax.
Oh, there you go. There you go. NHS, how dependent is it on US technology?
Oh, totally. the main system for recording all the NHS data is on an Oracle. Is done through Oracle, and it's stored in US-owned clouds, and most of the software throughout the NHS is US owned. Not all, but most. So in software terms, it is. In terms of equipment, things like knee joints and hip joints, typically supplied by a company called Stryker. Contact lenses, well over half the market is supplied by Johnson & Johnson. All those.
So hold on. So hip and knee joints in terms of the replacement, those are manufactured in the US, do we know? Or?
Yes, yeah.
So they're US companies manufactured in the US?
Yes, and used by the NHS. And they're great products. That's the thing. I'm not rubbishing the products. I'm saying we don't have a buy British policy here. And of course, they've got a huge market, certainly 6 times as large in terms of population, but probably larger because they do more operations of this sort than we do. So maybe 10 times the market. So you would expect us to be in a sense, we're benefiting from the research they do and from the size of their market. But they don't pass. I mean, they pass on the benefit by selling the products, but we pay full whack for them. The NHS does. But there's all sorts of other products where. So incontinence products, there's a sort of things that people don't like to talk about or even think about. That's dominated by US firms. So the US companies are big suppliers to the NHS from top to bottom, and the kind of left wing trope that they want to take over the NHS. You don't want to take over the NHS. The NHS is essentially a liability. What you want to do is to take over being the supplier to the NHS. And that's exactly what the Americans have done very successfully. It's not just physical products and software that I've mentioned. It's also they bought up quite a few GP practices. They supply psychiatric beds, the service, the whole package. They own quite a few of the private hospitals, where even the Labour Minister of Health is now saying he doesn't have a problem. He's comfortable with them supplying, doing operations for the NHS to reduce waiting lists. After all, his concern is the health of the people. And if he can get that by paying Americans, he'll do it. It's just my question, really, my challenge is, how did we get to here? Why have we allowed them to become so dominant and increasingly so? It's not just that. It's not a question of throwing one's hands up and saying, we've allowed them to get too much power. We're still doing it. The message of vassal state isn't that, we've become a vassal state and that's the end of it. It's we've become a vassal state and we're continuing to hand over our assets.
How bad do you want the vassalage to be? And we could claw back maybe some things, right? I mean, you talked about import substitution. I mean, where would you, and just to be clear, what does import substitution mean and where would you start?
Oh, sorry. So import substitution means instead of buying stuff from abroad, you make it yourself. And so the simplest, most straightforward is to say, instead of buying in foreign timber, you've grown your own trees. But that's true for manufacturing as well. I think it would start with not with a particular industry, but with a particular sort of policy. A policy by British, and say that all foreign companies must absolutely make sure that they pay the full tax, the same tax that the UK companies pay. So we've got a lot of multinationals paying, typically, from the figures that I've looked at, which actually come from the Americans, from the IRS, the American companies are typically paying 10% of their profits in tax. Now, the British are typically paying 25%, which is the corporation tax rate. So we're paying and over a number of years, a higher tax rate really makes a difference. There is a move to have a global tax system, and when that was first considered a generation ago, it was thought that should be at a 25% tax rate. It's now being discussed at a 15% tax rate. So it's not just that the corporations are paying less tax, or will be paying less tax if that's adopted, but it's that we're adopting wholesale the American philosophy of low tax. And we're doing it, the British and the Europeans are doing it sort of because they have to. They're sort of saying, well, 15% is better than nothing. And it's certainly better than 10%.
And that difference in 10 to 25%, I mean, that gives those firms like you say, over 10, 15, 20 years, it gives them even more money to then buy more assets in the UK. And it becomes this feedback loop of more and more resources being owned by an overseas country and those businesses paying less tax and them having an even greater advantage in the UK, etc.
And apart from the tax system itself, we help them in specific ways. One of them is that a lot of the tax havens that they use, for example, for transfer pricing, that of the 13 major tax havens, the British control 9 of them, so that they're using British dependencies to do this. So we're in a very, if we're complaining, unless we do something about those dependencies, we're in a slightly hypocritical position complaining about them not paying enough tax because we're helping them to avoid it.
What does the British government never do anything about that? It doesn't seem to make sense for me. You know, you're ultimately you're voted in, and politicians do things to be re-elected in a democracy. And at the same time, like you say, your basic ability to address problems that your voters really care about is undermined by the existence of Jersey, Guernsey, Cayman Islands, etc. Why don't they do something about it? There are big incentives to, surely.
They've done some things, but clearly not enough. There's local resistance in those countries, of course, where their economies are very much dependent on them being tax havens. They're also under pressure from not only the British company, not only American companies, but from British companies as well, not to close these sort of loopholes. And I suppose what they're trying to do with the global tax is to phase them out. So the global tax deal will reduce the influence of those, but at a low tax level.
Is that still happening with Trump? I mean, that was something that was really lauded by the Biden White House.
It is, but Trump, like Biden, Trump is also making that global tax deal absolutely conditional on the British and French dropping their digital tax. Now, the digital tax is a way of making sure that Amazon and Apple and particularly the streaming companies, making sure that they pay some tax. So it's a tax on turnover, so tax on the platforms really. But the British will have to drop that if the global tax deal gets agreed.
You mentioned Oracle, this massive technology company founded by Larry Ellison. I think he's not the CEO, he's the chairman today. He has given £100 million circa to the Tony Blair Institute. He's talked about giving significant amounts of money in the future too, maybe twice as much going forward. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds as well, but dollars is the figure that's bandied around, $300 million. That's unprecedented in British politics. The idea that a US firm and a US tech founder can inject that much money into the UK. Of course, we're now seeing Elon Musk say something similar with a party like Reform, potentially, or another party on the right. What protection should there be around this stuff? How would you stop US capitalist CEOs, billionaires, trying to influence policy outcomes in this country?
It's very hard, isn't it? Because they've got so much money, and it can very much always be presented as philanthropy, that they're donating money. In the past, of course, we had things like the Getty Foundation, which was much more about artworks, and so people weren't so worried about it. But now it's become political. I mean, we are a political football for them, that they can, and Britain matters, not just, as you say, because it's English speaking, but because it is seen as it's sort of, in world terms, it punches above its weight. The royal family of general interest, and perhaps surprisingly, and the links that we have to Europe and the Commonwealth countries mean that it's and I suppose also to an extent the British are influential in that they've got they have in some areas they have sort of cultural leadership, so it's a country that they want to influence, but I don't know how that can be countered, because you wouldn't expect the Tony Blair Institute to say no to $100 million, and they will use it for their purposes. But these billionaires, when we're getting to a situation where the billionaires, and we've seen it, of course, with Musk, have unprecedented power, because it's a combination of political power plus the ability to influence. So it's not just that he's got influence with Trump and got money to spend, which he has been spending on the sort of influence you've been talking about, but he's also got control of the platforms like Twitter, or Twitter, in his case, Twitter. But so it's very difficult. It's very difficult. We've put ourselves into a position of being subject to that influence in a way that other European countries haven't.
Well, you said other countries haven't, but I'm not so sure. So Trump got, I think, around $270 million from Musk in the last presidential campaign through this PAC, the America PAC, which had @America on X. It's wild. 270 million. And you think, well, if Musk tries to do the same with European elections over the next 5 to 10 years, he's going to get, if he can shut his mouth, right? Because the problem is he says wild things on social media, and actually that rallies people against the parties he's identified as allies of his. The AfD, for instance, did well. They doubled their vote, but they didn't outperform expectations. I think that's partly to do with the fact that they were being connected with Trump and his allies in the US. But if you can shut his gob and just give parties like Rassemblement National, who aren't quite the same as AfD, Reform, he could be changing a lot of political outcomes in Europe. And I think it's really lost on people in this country. You know, okay, we're not the US, but Europe is a continent of 500 million people. It's a massive, massive market. That's a great deal for a US billionaire to spend 100 million and get a couple of governments in their pocket.
Yes, well, there are two different dimensions being discussed, aren't there? There's the left-right political spectrum, and that's what people pick up. They say, oh, it's driving Europe to the right. But there's also the cultural and way of doing business spectrum. It's not just driving it to the right; it's driving it towards American ways of doing things. So it's sort of Atlanticist as well as on the right-left spectrum. So I think that's the real danger, that America turns other countries into an American shape.
So an Atlanticist watching this, an America stan watching this might say, yep, agree with all of that, agree with the vassalage thing. They're taking over. CEO's point, really powerful. Oracle, yep, they're back end of the NHS IT systems, they've got it. Which is why we should become the 51st state. That's what they would say, right? There's that level of independence. Why don't we just go all in? At least we have some democratic input in terms of the president, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to that?
I don't think we're being offered the chance to be the 51st state. I think Canada is. Oh, that might have been it was probably a joke and certainly won't happen. But we're being offered to be a dependency. And that's what we are. So we don't and won't have the political influence in Washington that a state would have. And I would say generally, becoming the 51st state, we'd still have the losses that I've identified in the book. The loss of income each year. So we're a much poorer country than people realise. The loss of assets as assets are taken over. The loss of people as some of the brightest tech and tech people and scientists go over to the US, and the loss of treasure as more and more of our artworks are bought up by Americans. So those processes where we're becoming impoverished to the benefit of America would continue to happen even if we were a whatever formal structure, even if we were a state. And the Americans don't mind having poor states. I mean, look at Mississippi. They're probably got a better tolerance of rich and poor than we have.
It would mean that if Britain was a state, and I don't think we should become one, obviously, it would mean that presidential races would be quite different, probably, or the Democratic primary would be quite different. For instance, you probably would have, a candidate who supports public health care, or a single payer option, as it's called in the US. You probably would have a candidate who supports that winning the Democratic nomination, because you have this new state of 68 million people feeding in.
Yes.
You don't think that?
Well, there are so many ifs and buts around it, aren't there? As you say, it would be a very big state, and I think it's just so inconceivable for that degree of political absorption. I mean, we're 2,000 miles away from New York and 20 miles away from France, so.
Well, I was going to say Hawaii, but I mean Hawaii is a long way from anywhere, to be fair.
Yeah. But I think certainly thinking about those things illustrate the way that America treats other countries, and indeed how exploitative it is. And I don't think being a 51st state would stop that, because that would be in name only.
I mean, I don't think that, but it is something that I've seen people on the right, more, let's call them heterodox voices on the right. They talk about Greater Britain, and they'll talk about, a union of Canada, the US, Britain as this kind of Atlantic entity, which I just find completely batshit, but there you go. I mean, that batshit things happen all the time these days, so who knows?
Well, there are surprising views amongst populations. Apparently, the people in Greenland are quite keen not to be part of Denmark, and they're more positive about America than you might think. By contrast, the Canadians are very, very anti-American in political terms, and apparently almost half of them would prefer to be part of the EU, which again would be a rather odd transatlantic union.
Well, I've got a funny opinion on this. I said this before we started. I said I have lots of strange opinions on things, which infuriate some people. But I think it sometimes makes this show a little bit more interesting. Angevin 2.0. Let's do it.
Sorry?
Angevin 2.0. France, UK. Let's do it. One country. What do you think?
Yes.
Maybe get the Canadians in too, right? They speak English and French. That's 200 million people?
Well, what would be the benefits? The benefit to Britain would be it would make it part of Europe. And in a way, that's... the book is unapologetically pro-Europe, both in terms of how they do business and in terms of a political alliance. But I don't think culturally this would work. But it would work better than a link with the US, because I think the British are more aligned with European values when it comes to what's important in life. So we don't work as hard as the Americans, and I don't think we should be ashamed of that. And we don't regard profit as everything. We're more concerned about other stakeholders and other values. And that's very much a European thing. And I think this sort of cutthroat profit before everything and don't worry about the staff is a very, or what they call them now, partners, is a very much more American culture. And I think from that point of view, at least, a British-French merger would make more sense than what we seem to have been drifting towards, which is a British-American merger.
You stand up to Russia. We'd have the economies of scale for a successful nuclear industry. Why not, right? Nuclear power do well. You got some great universities. And the point about the similarities, this is really, interesting. If you look at demographic complexion, the US, obviously different. It's literally started as a slave-owning republic. If you look at levels of secularism, all kinds of things. Obviously, France is a secular republic, but actually social attitudes on this stuff is really things like abortion, divorce, etc. Much more aligned, like you say, between us and France than they are between us and the US. And yet, the way our media class and much of our political class carries on, you'd think that the UK and the US are really similar. Sticking on the UK-US thing a little bit, FTSE 100 is, of course, the 100 largest companies in this country, which people can buy the shares of. Increasingly, FTSE, the London Stock Exchange, is finding companies don't want to list there. And actually lots of companies are now leaving the UK and they're delisting and then they're going to the US. Explain that phenomenon, what's happening and why is it bad for the UK in the medium long term?
Okay, well, UK companies listing in the US is bad for the UK because it takes business away from the City of London in the short term, but it also means that the company is more likely to end up being based rather than listed, based in the US. So that will put the better jobs into the US, sort of headquarter jobs, the market research jobs. It also means that the London Stock Exchange becomes less viable. So the remaining members of what is essentially a club, they have to pay more membership fees to be in the club. And it gives the British, there are many things connected with listing which are regulatory, where the government decide what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So it gives the American government influence, control really over how those companies list rather than the British government. So it's generally a bad thing. But the reason it's happening, and at the moment it seems almost it has seemed in the last few years almost irreversible. The reason it's happening is because the Americans are more flexible and more willing to relax their regulations for companies. So there's a fewer forms to fill in for companies wanting to list there. Still plenty to do, but not as many. And because the companies are valued more more highly there. So it's quite attractive to existing shareholders, so they don't oppose it. And finally, and probably the most important thing, is there's a culture of paying chief executives more. So if you're listed there, you can get away with paying yourself 2 million instead of 1. That's quite attractive to a person running a company.
Why are companies, and you hear this all the time, US buyers, US firms look at UK firms as underpriced, and if they relist in the US, all of a sudden they're more valuable. Why is that?
I think it's to do with it's not obvious, and it's certainly financial managers have been unclear on it, but generally the US stock market is valued more highly, probably because the companies are expected to grow more rapidly. But also, I think once they're US listed, US funds can buy them, and US funds, of course, have a lot of money. But so I think those are the main reasons.
So there's more liquidity flowing around, the capital markets are bigger, therefore it's more valuable.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose if you're a US listed company, there are probably some other advantages at the edges. You probably think you'll get less trouble with the US government if you're selling to the US. It's more prestigious, probably easier to hire top staff, but these are small relative to the other factors.
And the FTSE 250, which is not the 100 biggest companies you can buy shares in, but
the next 250 biggest. So that's why people sometimes talk about the 350, because they're including both the top 100 and then the next 250.
And some people think that won't exist in 10, 15 years' time. Or is that just catastrophist?
Well, it depends what you mean. They'll probably exist in the sense that they're listed, but they may well be less valuable. I mean, at the moment, we already know that the FTSE 350, that is all the biggest companies, have a total value of somewhat less than the value of one American corporation, Apple. Apple is worth more than all our companies put together.
That is incredible, isn't it? I mean, and that's really new.
Yeah. And Apple's not on its own. The Americans have what they describe as the Magic 7, which are basically the big 5 tech companies in NVIDIA. So these are Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, which is effectively Facebook. These are all capitalized at over $1 trillion. As I say, Apple has been recently as high as 3 trillion and more than all our companies put together.
And Tesla as well was touching $1 trillion, wasn't it? And then
Tesla's dropped in value.
Yeah, I mean, again, Elon Musk just keeps tweeting. He keeps on making podcast appearances. This is interesting as well because I think about this a lot with a younger audience. I've got our producers here; they're younger than me. They look much younger than me because they are younger than me. For our younger audience, it's really hard for them to imagine what pre-global financial crisis Britain was like. I remember in 2005 when Vodafone was one of the biggest companies in Europe by market capitalization. Vodafone was more valuable than Intel, which at that time was, a really valuable company. BP, Shell, HSBC, RBS were some of the biggest companies in the world. And now, RBS is just a trifling, tiny company now. It's a huge shift. And what's really interesting, Angus, is our political class, almost 20 years later, many of them still think we live in that world. Many of them still act like HSBC and BP and Shell are some of the biggest companies by market cap in the world. They're based here. They pay the corporation tax here. That's going to fund public services. It's not. But that whole model disappeared in 2007-8. And it does kind of still feel like if you talk to most politicians, their default isn't really to understand that.
No, and they're very complacent about the continuing prosperity of these companies. I mean, Shell seriously considered relisting in New York, which it hasn't done yet. And HSBC seriously considered relisting in Hong Kong, which again, it hasn't done yet, but it might split and half the business might split.
It is going to split, right? This whole East-West thing.
It's got a lot. Yes, it is operationally. Because it's got a lot of business out there.
But it might formally become two companies.
That was one of the ideas that was floated.
Like the Roman Empire.
Yes.
Isn't it?
So the politicians shouldn't. They take a lot for granted, but also they're so different. Very few of them have ever had to meet payroll, as you might say, have ever had to make sure that the money's there to pay the staff. and when they meet companies, it's often on a sort of factory tour. They're not. We don't have many people in Parliament whose experience is business. The nearest we've mostly got is people whose experience is professions, accountants and lawyers. And nothing wrong with them. They've got their place. I'm just saying Parliament's very unrepresented by business people.
I think that's true. And again, I had this conversation, I think, with Simon Cooper, who I really like, columnist at the FT. And, we were having this conversation. He's like, I thought this was a socialist podcast. But it is true that the definition of business for lots of politicians in this country is basically the supermarkets, consultancies, and people who've got loads of followers on LinkedIn, and that's business. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I do kind of feel that was borne out by Rachel Reeves increasing employers' contributions for national insurance in April, which is really, really terrible news for small businesses across the country.
Oh no, it's worse than that, Aaron. It's not just bad news for small businesses. Okay. It's really bad news. It's a tax on youth. It's a tax for youth unemployment. I mean, or budget for youth unemployment. I looked at the figures for national insurance, and what they've done is they only slightly increased the rate, the percentage that's charged, but they've hugely reduced the threshold, increased the so they've reduced it from 9,000 to 5,000. So they've increased the amount that they take from people who are low earners. So that particularly affects part-time workers and poor, less well-paid workers. So guess what? That mostly affects women. And what they've done is they've said, many of your jobs will go because it won't be sensible as it was before. See, in effect, what was happening before was employers were saying, well, we can employ women and pay them up to 9,000 a year part-time, and they will not have to pay any national insurance. And that was great for people who had a lot of caring duties, or whether it was men or women, but it obviously tended mostly to be women. And so they've not only made some of their jobs disappear, but the ones who keep their jobs, the employer will be saying, look, I've now got to pay national insurance. I can't give you a pay rise this year. I know prices have gone up, but I can't match that with what I pay you. So it was really an absolute own goal from a Labour chancellor. And the same, of course, applies for people who are less well paid, even if they're in full-time work. So it was a terrible, terrible way of raising money.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of small businesses who, it's less that Labour persuaded them, but the Tories have just lost them in the last sort of 10 years, particularly post-Brexit. I mean, it's really funny for me. There are lots of Conservative voters, particularly in the South, who didn't vote Brexit, and they were basically being described as, monsters and idiots by their own party. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to go elsewhere. Anyway, it's interesting in the last sort of period, particularly since 2020, seeing lots of small businesses who instinctively would have gone Tory, and they've tended to go Labour. And by the way, to some extent, that even preceded Keir Starmer. It was really striking for me how the Federation of Small Businesses would often say quite positive things about, McDonald's policies before 2019, just because the model we have, for some of the reasons you've outlined over the last hour or whatever, they haven't worked for small businesses in this country. So Labour was gradually winning these people over, and then 5 minutes after coming to office, they just hammer them, rather than tax really valuable assets, for instance. That'd be a really good thing. Yes, there was an increase in capital gains. I think it could have gone further. Maybe you have a slightly higher rate of VAT for luxury goods. I mean, I would love to see that personally. I think somebody paying $100,000 for something in Selfridges shouldn't be paying the same rate of VAT as Novara Media pays for a microphone. Of course, I'd say that. But that was really interesting to me, that even though they'd had this period to engage with those kinds of businesses, somebody like Rachel Reeves didn't really understand how damaging that policy was, because her vision of business is the supermarkets, the LinkedIn consultants, etc.
But also what that does is it taxes labour, and that's sort of many people, that's all they've got. And if it's taxed more highly, the employers will consume less of it, and basically lead to unemployment. And we see that with an organisation like McDonald's. and it's not a criticism of them, it's observing how they're responding to labour costs. They've automated the process of ordering, for example, as much as they can, so that it means they need fewer staff. And that's true in retail generally, that they're reducing the number of staff they need. And if they can replace retail with Amazon type deliveries, then often the delivery drivers, they're not subject to national insurance. So it's a cause and effect. And I think what Rachel Reeves has been doing is, unfortunately, setting up the conditions for increased unemployment.
I suppose there's a counter argument, which is UK productivity is chronically low, and actually increasing NI contributions for the employer is going to some extent, get rid of low productivity jobs and mean a reallocation of capital to higher productivity employment. Do you think that's true? Or?
I think it'll work in some sectors. I think that's right. I think there are some areas where people will say, well, if I can have one person driving this lorry instead of two, I'll install a crane so that I can unload things mechanically rather than by hand. Yeah, there'll be some cases where that will work, and that sort of thing would increase productivity. But I wouldn't really rely on that as a solution. I wouldn't rely on increasing labour costs as a solution to our productivity problems.
Do you think Labour as a political party gets the stuff you're talking about? There's a criticism, which is, it's the party of the professional managerial class, which I think is, in terms of the apparatchiks at the top of the party, to me that seems indisputable. And I think that, combined with the default Atlanticism, kind of leaves them very ill-placed to meet the challenges of the 21st century. What's your view on that?
Yes, I think the big redeeming feature for Labour politicians is they have constituencies. Without those, we'd be absolutely lost. I mean, there are lots of weaknesses of the constituency system, but it does mean most of them meet real people every week or two. So there is something, but they're still only meeting them. They're not really experiencing their lives, and they're not experiencing the life of being an employer, and the challenges of managing to pay the bills, whether it's business rates or national insurance.
Do you think without the constituency system that Labour would have just floated into La La Land?
I think it probably would, yes.
It sort of has already in some ways.
As you say, the professional classes would have lost touch, unfortunately, and particularly the London. Because even those that aren't London MPs, they're spending a lot of their time in London, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does make me think. Some of the things they come out with, I think, do you actually talk to normal people? I mean, like you say, they have to. They canvass, they knock on doors. Of course they do. Coming towards the end here, but why does reform instinctively support Atlanticism and vassalization so much? A party on the sort of radical patriotic right, why do they support these kinds of policies, these kinds of politics, while at the same time talking about sovereignty, taking back control, putting the UK first? There's a real tension there, and can you sort of dig a bit deeper?
There is, absolutely. And I mean, the beginning of my book, I say that we took back control, or we were told we were taking back control from Europe, but actually we were handing it over to America. And I think reform is doing exactly that. And then to the extent that Nigel Farage is friends with Trump, and I think this is one of those sort of friendships that you probably wouldn't want to be involved in, to the extent that he doesn't see Trump as a threat. But Trump is a passing phase. I mean, it may not seem it at the moment, with 6 or 7 weeks of a news storm of real changes as well as headlines. But in almost 3.5 years' time, 3.75 years' time, that will have passed, and reform will still be facing towards America. So I think it's a difficulty for them. It's put them in a difficult position, and he doesn't really know what to say about some of Trump's measures. So he's broadly keeping his head down.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a real Achilles heel for these guys in the medium to long term. The extent to which, quote unquote, patriotic European parties have venerated that relationship with Washington and with US business, it's really at odds with their voter base more than anything else, right?
But I suppose Trump is legitimizing a very anti-immigration and even anti-refugee policy. And to the extent that reform can benefit from that sort of sentiment, that they're benefiting from the Trump rhetoric. So it's a mixed blessing for them, and the numbers of people, new immigrants coming into the UK, is very much resented by a lot of working people. Labour may not like that, but it's a fact, and that's a real wind in the sails for the Reform Party. And I don't think Labour quite know what to do about it. Nor do I, actually.
Is the special relationship over?
Well, I'm not sure if it was there in the first place. I've heard it said it was a relationship of give and take, but I thought it was a relationship where we give and they take, and I think in that sense it's never been special. I quote in the book from one of the American civil servants, as we would call them, one of the American government officials, who said that we always talked about the special relationship in public as often as we could, but when the British weren't around, we laughed behind their backs about it. And you see that as well in the American ambassador to London. In an interview she had early on in the job, she quoted that she used the term special relationship, I think it was 21 times in a short interview. There's an issue of whether it's really special or whether it's something that can be referred to as special. I mean, it's an unusual relationship. That's no doubt about that, and it's been a long relationship, but it's not one that is being particularly beneficial. I think, in fact, it's being harmful, because it allows the British establishment to say, "Oh, don't worry, we can trust them. We've got a special relationship with them," while being walked all over. And I think it's that's coming unstuck at the moment, and will continue to do so.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And there's also the kind of vicarious prestige, isn't there?
Yes.
We don't need to address the challenges that face this country because we can get the afterglow of this connection to Washington. I really thought about this a few weeks ago when you had the press pack follow Starmer to Washington. They were all taking the selfies in the Oval Office, and you think, and I get it. If I was one of them, I'd be doing the same thing. I totally get it. This is so much more fun for you guys than reporting on somebody on poverty pay working in a logistics hub for Amazon in Rochdale, right? You can do that, and that's what political editors in this country do. They go to the Oval Office and they take selfies rather than talk about the stories of regular people. That's not because that's not. Maybe some of them are bad people. I don't know. It's not for me to judge. It's not because they're bad people. It's because of the incentives and seeking status in that industry means you do that thing.
Yes.
And it seems really damaging to the interests of this country.
And it's very much part of the sort of celebrity, the whole celebrity thing, that when you met a celebrity, you're always very positive about them, even though there hasn't changed what they're like. And we've seen this parade of leaders going to Washington, all wanting to go there to, as they say, kiss the ring and show their submissiveness to the US, but it's also they're showing that they're special enough that they can get a meeting in the Oval Office, which not all 180 countries can do.
On the special relationship, and people have been talking about that in the present tense, well, it means we're going to get a free trade deal with America. What's that going to look like? I mean, you've probably been reading around the edges.
We're now on our, I think, fourth Prime Minister who's been trying to get a trade deal with the Americans, and the Americans have had it hanging over the British and have used it as a weapon, the refusal to sign one. Whether a special relationship might reduce the amount of tariffs that the British pay, who knows? But what we do know, almost for sure, is that it will be to the Americans' advantage, because they're very transactional at the moment. They always have been, really, and they're negotiating from a position of strength. And that we know included in that transactional deal, which the British will just have to swallow, will be abandonment of the digital services tax on tech companies, the abandonment of certain standards that would have kept in the more industrialised food imports that the British really don't want, so that those will come as well, and generally terms that help American industry. Perhaps there's a slight there's a slight silver lining in that there are so many US companies in the UK that they might not want it to be, that the Americans won't want to punish them.
It seems like it could be really bad news for our farmers. Like tremendously bad news.
Yes, very much. Yes, because what the Americans are so brilliant at is making things efficient and industrializing, and they've done that very well. But that has consequences, and it has losses, and it has victims, and so they've made the production of food very, very efficient, merciless, and if they then compete in a free market with UK farmers with not these huge economies of scale and with various constraints about health and staff welfare and so on, then it's quite likely that the farmer will lose out and will basically be pushed out of the market, or the prices will just drop as far as the farmer's concerned. Yeah.
It's interesting that people like Reform, etc., are taking their barbers and flat caps down to the protests when it comes to, our agricultural sections country, and saying, we'll stand with you to stop the inheritance tax, which, by the way, I'm not so sure about the thresholds, but it's a real problem. People using agricultural land as a tax dodge, particularly things like grouse moors and whatnot. But anyway, it's interesting that at the same time they're pro a free trade deal, and I'm thinking, do you even have any idea what that's going to mean for these same farmers you're alongside? Have you seen Darkest Hour?
No.
You've not seen it?
Tell me about it.
So it's, again, people might think, Aaron, you're meant to be a socialist. You're talking about a film with Churchill. But it's interesting. You talked earlier on about that deal about getting the 50 or 100 ships in exchange for leases on 99-year leases on various military bases and whatnot. But it's really interesting. You've got Churchill speaking to FDR, and he's saying, it's before that deal. And then he says, can we at least get the planes we already bought from you? We've already bought from you, right? And FDR says, we can't do it because it's going to look like it's active support. We're neutral. And as we know, FDR wasn't hostile to the UK. It was more Congress was really holding him back. FDR says, we can't do it. What we can do is we'll put them by the Canadian border and your guys can come and bring them across.
Yes.
And Churchill goes, okay, great. Well, get the lorry, the mechanized sort of vehicles down there. He goes, no, it can't be machines. You're going to have to use horses. And Churchill, and you can see the man's face just sort of collapse. And even then FDR goes, well, maybe it might have to be, it might actually have to be men. And that is the special relationship, right? Even something you've bought, we're going to humiliate you to use horses to cross the border, to take them into Canada. And you think, Christ, even 80 years later, the wall has not been pulled from people's eyes on this stuff.
No, absolutely. No, I've seen pictures of those planes being hauled over the border. Yes, it's strange.
It's humiliation at the time. And again, I'm a critic of imperialism. But it's humiliation for this incredibly powerful country. And Brits don't seem to know much about it. Angus, I could go on all day. I won't. Thanks for joining us again on Downstream.
Thank you very much.
For people who are curious about this, it is a great book. Vassal State. How's it done in paperback?
Really well, yes. The publishers never give me the numbers, but then I also don't ask. But I think with a book, it's not just about how many you sell; it's about how much you get the ideas out there.
Yes.
And certainly the Novara podcast has been very helpful in that, but also so have the positive reviews and people discussing the issue. I mean, I'm after all not interested in a book for the sake of making money. Most people who are in the wrong business for that. They're unwise. They won't make money from books, but you can get ideas out there. And I think people are really waking up to the way that America runs Britain.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, non-fiction is not a money spinner. Angus Hanton, thanks again for joining us. Maybe we'll get you in for a third time. Maybe if Trump goes for a third presidency, who knows? But yeah, been great talking to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron.